I read a lot this summer. It's basically all I got done. So today I'm going to share my very favorites, both that were new this year in 2019 and just the favorite books I read over the last 3 months. Welcome to Explore Your Enthusiasm, episode 275. I am Tara Swiger, and for the past 6 years, I've shared my monthly reading list on my site, taraswiger.com. If you go to the show notes or you look below, you will find that linked up so you can see all of the months for over 6 years there. And since January of 2018, I've actually shared that list. And since January of 2018, I've actually shared that list here on the podcast, starting with episode 192. Every month I shared the books I had read and that I liked. There were a lot of business books at the time, some fiction, some parenting books have snuck in there over the years. I've heard from a lot of you that you love to listen to me talk about books. You love to talk books with me over on Instagram or in the comments on YouTube. So I am making even more bookish videos. I've been doing it for a couple months. And I'm starting a book club. So you can find all of the details at the show notes, taraswiger.com/podcast275. For more bookish videos, make sure you've subscribed on YouTube. And if you want to know my monthly to be read list, you want to vote on what I talk about the podcast, you want to join the book club, you want to go to patreon.com/taraswiger. So the other thing I hear from you is that you're busy. You may not read 100 plus books in a year, and you want to know what are the best books. Like, okay, great. You read 10 books last month, but what were your absolute favorites? So here on the podcast, instead of doing a monthly podcast of everything I've read for the past month, I know you're busy, so I am going to boil it down to what I read that was the absolute best, my all-time favorites each season. So we're going to start today by talking about my favorite books of the summer, and then the next one will be probably in around November, where I'll talk about my favorite books of the fall. I will still be doing the monthly roundup videos, but they'll be over on YouTube and they'll be at my site, taraswiger.com. So if you still want to get like all of it, the good and the bad, you can check them out there. Before we dive into my favorite books I read this summer, I want to thank some of my newest supporters of the podcast. If you want to be publicly thanked and you want to join that book club, you can join these supporters over at patreon.com/taraswiger. First up, a giant thank you to Rachel Heron, who has been a longtime patron, supporter, listener to the show, and she's the author of the new book Stolen Things, which is one of my most favorite recent books. In the show notes, I have linked up to a full review of this book and a link to where you can find this book and you can get your copy of Stolen Things. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in a minute, but I just wanted to thank Rachel for being a patron. I also wanted to thank my dear friend and fellow podcaster, Cece of GeekyGirlsKnit.com and the Geeky Girls podcast. Cece is the reason I got to teach in the UK back in 2016. She is an awesome knitter, designer, friend, and awesome supporter of the show. So thanks, Cece. Make sure you check out her link over in the show notes. You can find those again at taraswiger.com/podcast275, or if you look in the notes below wherever you are listening to this, you will find that linked up. So now let's talk about my favorite books. These are the books I read from June to August 2019. They're not necessarily new, although a lot of them are. So I'm going to share these by category because that's kind of how I could boil it all down. Now the thing is, I don't normally read that many new books, like books that came out this year, because I get most of my books at the library, but I realized I read over 15 books that were published in 2019 just in the last 3 months, so a lot of these are going to be new. Hopefully that will help you decide if you want to read them. Part of it is because I was reading along with the Modern Mrs. Darcy Summer Reading Guide, which I talked about in a previous episode of the show. It'll be linked up in the show notes. And in part because I was reading a lot of my book of the month club books. So it's one of the few ways I ever buy books unless I'm buying them used is from the book of the month club. I'm going to share a link in the show notes so you can check it out. That's where 3 of my favorites came from. So they always have good picks. I always end up liking them. It's not like a paid anything. It's just that's the fact of the matter. By far the biggest category that has the most favorite books this year or this summer has been the mystery thriller category. And all of the ones I'm going to talk about were just published here in 2019. They're newer. There's something about reading a thriller that just came out that I love. I don't know quite what it is, but I think it's something about like you know the twist ending, like right away. You don't have to wait for it. You don't accidentally get spoiled by it. Now, the other thing that I've really loved about these, and why all of these ended up on my favorites list, is because they're about more than just the mystery. They're about more than you first think they are. So I'll tell you as I'm talking about them, what is the more that they're actually about, because they're all really good. They all are commenting on a social issue in a way that you don't expect at first. Hopefully knowing that won't spoil them for you. So first up, I read this on a plane on my way to see my family in Oregon, and I loved it. It's called Before She Knew Him by Peter Swanson. It is a domestic suspense novel that is really not about if she knows him, if he knows who she is, this new neighbor comes to town. It's not really about that. It's really about what it's like to think that something's going on, but because of your past mental health issues, no one believes you. Or you're afraid no one will believe you and they'll just think it's paranoia. So what is it like to be somebody who's been in the system for having mental health issues, and then you're trying to point out this thing that you think is true, or is it? Is it just your brain playing tricks on you, or is it like real, and will anybody believe you if it is real? That's what Before She Knew Him is really about. That doesn't spoil the ending at all. And part of what I loved about it is there is a full-time artist at the center of it. The main female protagonist, she is making her living as a full-time artist, and she goes to work in her art studio, and that is part of where all of the suspense happens. Okay, so next up is The Better Sister by Ala Fairburke. So I read a couple months ago, if you've been listening to the podcast, you know that I think it was last year, I read like all of the books by Ala Fairburke. She's a mystery writer. She did a series that follows this detective. The Better Sister is not in a series. It's a standalone. You could read it right now. And it is about two sisters. One of them gets into some trouble, and one of them is like the slacker sister, always doing whatever she wants. She's the one you expect to get in trouble, but the other one is like uptight, has her whole life together, I think she's running a magazine. She's very famous. And what it's actually about is not the mystery of like what happened. It's actually about what women deal with on the internet, the mass amounts of hate that streams at famous women on the internet. She's not even that famous. She's just an editor of a magazine, but she is dealing with, from the very beginning, just tons of tweets, tons of Instagram comments, and then of course tons of like Reddit threads about what a horrible feminazi she is, and how they think she's evil and she's ugly and she's fat. And like you see that effect on her kind of mental health as the book goes on. And she talks about how like sometimes she claps back at people on Twitter and how good she feels about it, but how like not good it is for her to be looking at it every day. It actually what happens to her reminded me a lot of Gamergate. And so if you're interested in reading a novel that's very modern in that it is dealing with what it's like to have Twitter hate streaming at you nonstop, this book is not about it's not about the internet at all. It's about something that happens in her real life. But that is something that's always going on in the back of her head. And if you have any kind of platform online, you know that even as you're living your life, some of it is always going on in the back of your mind, whether it's should I put this picture on Instagram, or I gotta frame this right, or what will the caption of this be, or for me, how do I turn this into a podcast episode? But that is always going on kind of in the back of your head. And if you have a platform with a lot of hate pointed at it, it can be really damaging. So it's A Better Sister by Ala Fairburke. The book is just fun to read. That makes it sound more serious than it is. So next up is Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. This is one of the Book of the Month books that I absolutely loved. This is a mystery in which a woman gets paid really, really well to be an apartment sitter in New York City. And she takes the job, even though it's sketchy, because she really needs the money. And what this is really about, and this isn't going to spoil it, but it's about people who are so desperate that they take jobs that are maybe not that safe and not good ideas. But they don't ask the deeper questions or look more into it because they need the money and they need the place to stay, and they don't have a support system to lean on. And the ways that you can be taken advantage of if you're in that place, and the ways in which our economy has put a lot of people in that place. So that is Lock Every Door. This is also, fun isn't the right word. It's very dark. It's like a gothic suspense novel. So it's very atmospheric, and I loved it. Plus, you gotta love the colors on that cover. That's Lock Every Door by Riley Sagar. The next one I absolutely loved. And again, these are just my favorites. I read way more mysteries and thrillers. These are my absolute favorites. The next up also has an amazing cover, and that's Stolen Things by R.H. Herron. So R.H. is Rachel Herron. You might know her because she is the author of a lot of knitting books. So I loved her memoir called Life in Stitches, which is about learning to knit, following along with the stories of her own life. But she's also done lots of like women's fiction about knitting that is very fun. She's also done some romance. This is her debut as a suspense writer, and I loved it. It is like edge of your seat, but also deeper. So the way that this one is deeper is it is about a mother-daughter relationship, and it is about how a family deeply embedded in the police culture, because the mom's a former officer and now she's a dispatcher. The dad is a local chief of police. How does that family deal with police brutality? And the movement in the book is Citizens Against Police Brutality, but it's similar in vibe to Black Lives Matter. How does a family of color who is deeply embedded in police culture kind of deal with the social issues around racism and policing and social justice? But it's super fun and it moves quickly, and it's a lot about what it feels like to be a 16-year-old girl dealing with your mother when you actually really need your mother, and to be the mother of a 16-year-old girl. So it's told from two perspectives, both the mom and the daughter. There's no like untrustworthy narrator. They're both just telling you, and like to see how they misunderstand each other is great and felt very true to life. I actually did a whole review and reading vlog of what I thought of this book over on YouTube. I'm going to link it up in the show notes, so go check them out there, and I'll link up where you can get this book and all the books I'm talking about over at tarswiger.com/podcast 275. So that's Stolen Things by R.H. Herron. It just came out in August of 2019. The final one I want to talk about is The Farm by Joanne Ramos. This was marketed as a little bit of a thriller, but it was actually more, I felt like more literary fiction to me. There wasn't that much mystery going on, and the mysterious things weren't necessarily dangerous or super suspenseful, but it was beautifully written, excellent kind of way of looking at the issue of unpaid, I'm going to call them the caring class. So the class of mostly women workers who take care of the children of the very wealthy. So it's actually about a place, kind of a farm of women who are being paid top dollar to be surrogates for women who don't or can't carry their own babies. And it is kind of expanding on the idea of when you pay women who are coming from fragile living situations, whether they've just recently immigrated or they don't speak the language or they have an unsafe domestic life at home, when you pay them to move into your house and take care of your children, or to move into this farm and be surrogates, how is that taking advantage of them, and what is a power structure like? And you learn this through both the eyes of the woman who runs the farm, two of the surrogates, one who is a recent immigrant from the Philippines and has mostly worked as housekeeper, and also through the eyes of a well-off white girl who's decided to be a surrogate just because she's like pushing against everything her parents have expected from her after they've paid her way. She doesn't want to rely on them anymore. So you can see all of those different perspectives kind of overlap in this book. So good. That's The Farm by Joanne Ramos. Now, that's it for my fave mystery thrillers. As a quick overview, that was Before She Knew Him by Peter Swanson, Stolen Things by R.H. Herron, The Better Sister by Ala Fairburke, Lock Every Door by Riley Sagar, and The Farm by Joanne Ramos. Again, you can find links to all of those over in my show notes, but let's go on to the other favorite books that I read. It's not all mystery thrillers. So my favorite new graphic novel is The Unstoppable Wasp by Jeremy Whitley. It is the volume I read is called Girl Power, Girl Power, and it's just so great. So if you're watching over on my site or on YouTube, you're going to see the video of the art. It's very colorful. It's very fun. I don't want to spoil anything for you. So it is a story of a young girl who's new to America who is a superhero, the Unstoppable Wasp, and she puts together a girl group of the super smartest people on the planet are actually a lot of girls and women, but science and superheroes has been all told from the perspective of old white men, like in this universe, like Dr. Pym and Ant-Man and Tony Stark and even Spider-Man, right? Peter Parker. Those are the smart guys. Those are the smartest people in the world, but they're all guys. Where in reality, right now, the smartest person in the entire Marvel universe, according to the Marvel comics, is Lunella Lafayette, who is a young girl who has a dinosaur, and she is a super, super smart scientist. And so her, along with Mockingbird and a few other women scientists, basically create this lab where they are going to solve problems and fight crime, and it is super fun. It would be good for anywhere from like a 14-year-old girl all the way to, grown women. Absolutely love it. The Unstoppable Wasp, and then the title is Girl Power, Girl Power. That's going to show you the beginnings of RL is the name of their lab, their Girl Power lab. So I'm going to be reading the next volumes in this, definitely, but this just came out in 2019. The Unstoppable Wasp by Jeremy Whitley. Now, I also read 2 really great memoirs this summer. The first was The Valedictorian of Being Dead by Heather Armstrong. I read that while doing a 24-hour readathon that I vlogged, so I talked a lot about the process of reading that book. It's the story of Heather Armstrong, who is Deuce, if you're familiar with that blog. It's one of the first mommy blogs from a decade ago. So Heather receives experimental treatment for her depression, and the memoir just covers that period of her life while she's receiving that experimental treatment. And it's great. She describes depression so well. I loved it. You can see a bigger review and like what I thought as I was reading it over on the vlog. I'll link it up. And I also read Save Me The Plums by Ruth Reichel, which is the memoir of her time at Gourmet Magazine. So I don't know if you got Gourmet Magazine, but it was a completely beautiful magazine. She transformed it. She made it more modern. She got Jonathan Franzen to write about things. She changed up like who the authors were that they worked with, the kind of recipes they did, the kind of restaurants they reviewed. I loved her previous book, Garlic and Sapphires. I read that in the spring as a preparation to read her new book, Save Me The Plums, and it's very enjoyable, especially if you love food and food culture. I think you'd really like it. Now, my favorite new book just came out this year in kind of the mental health genre is Maybe You Should Talk to Somebody by Laura Gottlieb. This was so great. So this is a story, I think the subtitle is like the story of a therapist and her therapist. And it is Lori Gottlieb is a therapist, and she shares 4 stories of her, clients. She's working with patients, and also the story of why she sought therapy and what it was like to work with a therapist. And in it, she talks about kind of the basics of what therapy should be doing in your life, and the relationship that you make with a therapist, and as a therapist that she makes with her patients, and how that unconditional positive regard, which is what your therapist is always supposed to be holding towards you, gives you a kind of safe place to open up and share. And so whether you have ever done therapy, you're interested in therapy, you have just any interest in improving your mental health, definitely check out Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Laura Gottlieb. I got so much out of it, like totally separate from the therapy angle, just the way she talks about mental health and relationships was really beautiful and helpful for me. So another book that I loved that is kind of mystery thriller but is really, really sci-fi is Recursion by Blake Crouch. This is another Book of the Month Club book, and oh my gosh, it is so good. If you read Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, I think you'll like it. It is very, very twisty. It is time travel that deals with what would happen to our timeline if time travel was allowable, and what does time travel, what does time and our timeline, how would that affect our memory? And also deals with issues like Alzheimer's and memory loss and memory and time travel, and oh my gosh, it's so good. You got to read it. So that's Recursion by Blake Crouch. I can't say any more than that because I feel like I would be giving stuff away, but if that interests you, read it. There is a female scientist at the center of this that creates the machine. You kind of find that out right away, so check it out. Recursion by Blake Crouch. And then my next books aren't even new books. So I found 2 new series that I am loving and that I am reading through. And I found them this summer. The first is the Inspector Gamache series by Louise Penny. The first book is called Still Life. The most recent one I read is A Rule Against Murder, which is book number 4. These books follow the Inspector Armand Gamache, who is the head of the murder squad at the Sûreté de Quebec. Practicing French adjacent words. He is basically the leader of detectives who look into murders, and a lot of murders keep happening in the little town of Three Pines. So the first 2 books are set in Three Pines. Then the 4th book kind of follows Inspector Gamache when he's someplace else. It has some recurring characters. The books that are set in Three Pines, it's a recurring place, a recurring setting, recurring characters. You get to know them. What I like about reading these is you want to read them in order because the characters develop and their storylines develop across several books. So one of the kind of ongoing mysteries just got explained more in book 4. So each book is kind of like an episode of Buffy, that there's like the mystery of the week, and then there's a mystery of the book, but then there's also the longer big storyline that's going on that you're not quite sure in the beginning how much it matters, and then as the stories go, as the books go, it gets more and more important. They're beautifully written, cozy mysteries. So there's not a lot of blood, there's not a lot of gore, there's not a lot of suspense even really. Things are unfolding and people are using their powers of deduction. And one thing that recurs again and again is the inspector talks about how listening is really his job. Listening not just for words, but for emotions. Because at the heart of every crime is emotions. And so that's the kind of... that gives you a feel for the kind of perspective the books take and the kind of vibe. They're very thoughtful and not fast, suspense, edge of your seat, and they're very enjoyable to read. I kind of think of it as having a cup of tea and eating shortbread. Like, it's just very relaxing. I kind of want to save up more of the books to read over the winter because they're set in a Canadian town where it always seems to be winter or freezing. And even though I guess the 3rd one, The Cruelest Month, took part in April, which is still a pretty cold spring in Quebec. So anyhow, I'm going to be reading a lot more this winter, and a new one just came out. Book 15 just came out in the Louise Penny series. So if you have been reading these, let me know. I know these are super popular, so tell me if you've been reading them and which one your favorite was. Now, another new series that I love and fell in love with, well, it's new to me, it's not new to the world, and it's a new fantasy series. It is Every Heart a Doorway by Shannon McGuire. I think these might be YA. They are a little dark. For me to think of them as very YA, but maybe like older teenager YA. Every Heart a Doorway is the first book. The series is actually called the Wayward Children series. And what it is about is children who Like Alice in Wonderland or the kids in Narnia, they step through a doorway that appears only to them, and they enter a world that perfectly fits them. So these are children that didn't feel like they fit in anywhere else. They enter this world that like fits them and they feel at home with, even though some of the worlds are very dark and scary. Some of the worlds are made of sugar. Some of the worlds are worlds of the living. Some are not. And some are very logical, some are very nonsense driven. The first book introduces you to a home where these children go to recover, is what the woman who runs it tells the parents, but in fact they go there to just not be alone. And then book 2 and 3 actually follow some of the children through their doorway to see what their story is like. They're very slim books. They're under 200 pages and they're just very delightful. I did a reading vlog while I read Every Heart a Doorway, and I will link it up in the show notes so you can see more of how I was feeling as I was reading it. It was delightful. Very, very beautifully written. I love the tone of the narrator, and it's just fun to read. Now, the last book I'm going to talk about is a book I was completely surprised by, and it is the one book I want all of you to read. Maybe I want all of you to read Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, and then I also want all of you to read Station 11 by Emily St. John. So you got to listen to the whole description because it totally wasn't what I thought it was. Station 11 is set in a post-apocalyptic world. Kind of in the first chapter, something apocalyptic happens, kind of like the swine flu outbreak, except for it goes all across the world, and in just a couple days, a huge percent of the population is gone. However, it's not a post-apocalyptic survival or battle, dark, like, factions kind of book at all. Instead, it's a story of a traveling Shakespeare theater troupe. And it is about how art is necessary even in the darkest times, because it's important that we not just survive, but that we thrive, that we have art and beauty, that we fall in love, that we make babies, that we give our children hope, and that we look out for each other. That's what it's really about. And it's beautifully written. It's literary fiction. Like, it's not a genre, it's not written in a genre style. It's written more like a modern literary fiction novel. And the settings are gorgeous. The themes are beautiful. There is a little bit of scariness, especially when the outbreak first happens. And then, of course, there's some people who use this to become cult leaders, but there are just a lot of people who are trying to survive and trying to make the world more beautiful, and that's who it spends most of the time with. So it's Station 11 by Emily St. John. I had heard this book recommended so much, but nobody had ever talked about what it was about, so I had no idea. When I picked it up, I was like, oh, this is post-apocalyptic, okay, and then I read it, and then I was like, oh, this is not what you expect when you hear post-apocalyptic. So it is not horror-y, it is not mystery, really. It is not really even sci-fi. Like, it's very grounded in reality of what it would be like to go through this experience. So that is a book I was completely surprised by, and that I think you should read. I am looking forward to sharing my most favorites with you once a season. Again, you can see everything that I've read every month over at taraswiger.com. I do a video update on those, so you can catch those. If you've subscribed to my emails, then you will get those emailed to you every week. You don't have to remember to go to my site. And be sure that you've subscribed to this podcast if you want to hear this season roundups. Before I go, I want to thank Anna of Ragtime Design for supporting the show. Anna makes beautiful one-of-a-kind toys. They're really stunning. Like, she didn't tell me what to say. I went to her site and they were beautiful. I also want to thank Jana Ford, knitter and knitwear designer, for supporting the show and listening. You can go find links to Anna's work and Jana's work over on the show notes, and you can thank the supporters for supporting the show and making it happen. You can see the gorgeous work they do over at taraswiger.com/podcast 275. I can't believe we're in episode 275. Remember that you can join them in getting extra videos each month and in joining the book club, which is going to happen each quarter over on patreon.com/tarswiger. We're actually going to pick our book in the next couple weeks. And if you enjoyed this episode, leave a review on iTunes or give the video a thumbs up, and be sure you subscribe wherever you're listening. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a very enthusiastic, book-filled week.